Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally, and if you are one of the majority of Americans who does not align with either major party, and if you are one of the majority of Americans who would like more and better choices on the ballot, welcome to the podcast that believes two parties are too few. Now, at the time of this recording on Friday, a law that would effectively ban TikTok in the United States was set to go into effect over the weekend. Little did we know this would be the shortest geopolitical staring contest in American history. But even with the ban on hold, its passage poses serious questions about the influence big tech has over policy and whether we're seeing another instance of the U.S. government using national security as a pretense for doing an end run around the Constitution. Sean and I had a lively discussion, which I hope you'll enjoy. So without further ado, here we are. Sean, we are recording this as usual on Friday, January 17th. In 2 days, the TikTok ban goes into effect. And about an hour ago, I got a notification that the Supreme Court had opted to uphold the TikTok ban.
Yeah.
Curious, thoughts on this?
It's unfortunate that an app like TikTok was put in that position where it had to be, where I'm not going to say had to be, but it was banned over issues of security, privacy. Those are the stated reasons. I think for a lot of TikTok users, including myself, those concerns are certainly valid. Like you don't want particularly an adversarial government to have free access to American data. Although, when I think about the TikTok CEO had gone before Congress and said, this wasn't happening, at least not to the extent that you are suggesting that it is. Mm-hmm. And we are building American infrastructure to ensure a separation between foreign governments and American data. And I think without more evidence presented to the public, this ban just seems like a form of unnecessary censorship.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And first off, data security.
Yeah.
Okay. If I say the word tacos, my phone blows up with pictures of tacos, Taco Bell, taco-shaped pillows, right? I've got an idea. How about instead of banning TikTok, they pass that data privacy law that everybody's been asking for years? Before this conversation, I looked it up. Pew did a poll last year. 72% of adults polled, 68% of Republicans, and 78% of Democrats said there should be more government regulation on what companies can do with personal information. So it is a bipartisan issue. And I can't help but think that the reason for this ban is the fact that it protects US-based tech platforms. Because if you were to implement privacy regulations, that would solve the TikTok problem, but it would also cause some problems for Meta and for X and for all the other platforms that want to take our data and sell it. And they're not going to make that happen.
I think when you look at the relationship between Silicon Valley and the government, I don't think it is such a tinfoil thing to say that this was all intended to protect Meta and to protect Google and to protect domestic companies and their interests. Because you can see this sort of, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back, a thing happening between tech CEOs and members of our government. Case in point, the fact that Mark Zuckerberg said that they are no longer going to do moderation on Facebook as a response to Trump going into office, because that's been his thing. That's been the argument from the MAGA crowd, is that fact checkers are unfairly biased against MAGA and conservatives, and this notion of misinformation, disinformation coming from that side. When you look at it and you see that, well, I mean, if most of the disinformation is coming from one side, that's not really a bias. That's just most of the disinformation is coming from that side.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, maybe your people just believe some like crazy stuff,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right? Just maybe. I mean, I'll kind of take the longer view on this as well, which is if you look historically, the US government has never really liked free speech.
Mm-mm.
They've never really liked it, and they've always taken measures to restrict free speech when they could. Now, they can't outright ban free speech, but what they can do is they can create consequences for speech they don't like. So, the best example is the Red Scare, right?
Mm-hmm.
1940s, 50s, you had academics, you had government officials, you had other notable people being pulled before Congress to testify about alleged communist ties, and their lives were ruined. And the message that was sent out there is, we can't make it illegal for you to be a communist, but we can make it career suicide for you to do so. And so that drove support for communism and other left leaning ideologies down. Fast forward. So, in the aftermath of the 2016 election, Democrats pull tech CEOs before Congress to testify about how they did too little to censor out Russian disinformation.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2020, Republicans called those same CEOs in front of Congress to testify about doing too much, about censoring conservative voices and how that might have negatively impacted Trump's reelection, right? So maybe a group of Russians sitting in a troll farm with passing knowledge of American culture and the English language managed to tilt the 2016 election in favor of Trump. And maybe, just maybe, people not getting access to InfoWars during the 2020 campaign ultimately made fewer people vote for Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Or, and hear me out on this, Sean, okay? Maybe Trump and Clinton lost because nobody liked them.
Yeah.
And the disinformation had nothing to do with it. But the bigger point here is that what Congress is doing, or the message that they sent in those hearings, was that if you promote speech we don't like,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to regulate you.
Right.
And it's the threat of regulation that they use as a cudgel to get these social media companies to comply. And when you have a social media platform like TikTok that they can't regulate in the same way, that causes a problem.
Mm-hmm. So last year I wrote a article called "TikTok Has No Place in the Two-Party Duopoly," and one of the things I point out is with American companies, in a way, you can again, this relationship between Silicon Valley and the US government. The US government can say, hey, we are not going to, go after you on antitrust or any of these other laws that, some of these companies should, be reasonably be subject to, as long as, you cater your algorithm to favor the speech that we want you to favor. Or in the case of like Facebook, as a editor of an independent news outlet, I can tell you the algorithm is designed on Facebook to favor legacy media over independent sources, and independent news is just squashed.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair, TikTok does a fair amount of censoring itself. I think one of the funniest after effects of this ban is that a whole bunch of TikTok users migrated over to RedNote, which is an app that's owned by the Chinese Communist Party. And in order to get in, you have to pledge allegiance to the Chinese Communist Party. Like, it's part of their terms and conditions, right? And what's gone on? You have this whole influx of Americans on this new app. And what's going on? They're interacting with English speaking Chinese people, and they're learning a little bit more about their country. The Chinese are getting access to these Americans, and the tech censors for the Chinese government can't keep up with it because they don't have the English skills necessary to censor out English content. So what you have is all this English language content flooding into the country, and all these Chinese people being exposed to stuff and ideas that they just never talked about and never knew existed. So I think it's phenomenal. I think the whole thing is great. And I think what's interesting here is it highlights the real problem that states are going to have regulating this sort of thing. Because not only do you have a situation like a bunch of Americans can just crash through the Great Firewall by downloading an app. But in another 5 to 10 years, with advances in AI, the barrier to being able to code these platforms is going to fall. And so now, yeah, you might be able to regulate platform X or platform Y out of existence, but some bored teenager sitting in his bedroom can whip up an app that becomes the next viral sensation in the matter of a day. And so I think that presents a good challenge for governments.
Mm.
I think it makes it impossible, and I am absolutely loving it.
There's a valid concern there with apps like TikTok on how much of our data, how much of our private information is going in the hands of an adversarial government. But to your point, now you have, upwards of 700,000 people who have downloaded RedNote, which there is no debate that is owned by the Chinese Communist Party. There's no debate there, right? You could have this debate about TikTok, about how much information is going, to the, CCP, but with RedNote, there is no debate. It is going to an adversarial government, and I think the interesting thing about that is, the conversation now that you're hearing in the mainstream media about this whole RedNote thing is people. It just shows that people want to be part of a social media app owned by another company. No, this is an FU to the U.S. government. More than anything, this is a big middle finger by all these people who are about to lose access to an app that they loved. Now that's about to get banned.
100%. I mean, RedNote's description of the App Exchange is in Chinese. It's not an easy platform for English speakers to use. The English translation is terrible, and you're 100% right. And look, I don't find it hard to believe that the Chinese government might be collecting our data through TikTok and might have plans to do something nefarious with it, right?
Right.
That being said, I mean, there was already a pretty significant data breach by the Chinese government of our telecom systems and a whole bunch of other systems. And the post-mortem is like, we don't know if they're still there.
Right.
Right? They could be in our phones anyway.
Right. And there's a history of companies like Meta, like Google, selling our data to the Chinese government.
Yeah.
To foreign government. We're not seeing any substantial law to actually protect our data from being accessed by foreign entities and governments. It's just a matter of, hey, our domestic companies want to be able to sell that. They don't want even the chance that this data is being accessed by these entities for free by a company that our government can't control because it's based in Singapore.
It's funny. So I tweeted today about how maybe the government should implement that data privacy law everyone's been asking about. And the Libertarian Party of Orange County replied and said, maybe the federal government should stop spying on American citizens. So there's a whole lot to say. Yeah. There is a whole lot to say.
And I mentioned this today on Blue Sky. It's helped so many Americans build and expand their businesses. It has, again, presented a space for political dialogue that goes beyond the traditional two-party narrative, which is what most Americans say they want. And it's helped build communities of people. People are having conversations on TikTok, being able to connect on TikTok in a way that they haven't been able to on any other social media app. Mm-hmm. So in a way, it has served a very important role for 170 million Americans. And there are ways to address those privacy concerns, those data concerns, as you talked about, with these data privacy bills that have been offered up. We have the solution up there, but members of Congress are just like, no, we're just going to ban this app and not even address the real issue, which is, par for the course for Congress to not really dig deep into what the real issue is.
Yeah. Yeah. Now I've heard an argument, and this was actually based on a conversation I had with a guy named Matthew Feeney, who works for the Cato Institute, which, if you're unaware, is a big libertarian think tank, right? His argument against any tech regulation is the fact that it would create a legal moat around the established tech platforms. That if you make it too onerous to create and manage a tech platform, then it might suppress upstart competitors. And I think there's some merit to that. I think what's really interesting about all this, and this is at the risk of repeating what I've already said, is just how toothless governments appear in the wake of this. And
when I think about this idea that, if you have an overly regulated industry, it's going to create this moat. You limit competition, the ability for competition to emerge. When you have an under-regulated industry, that is an issue that happens. Because right now, you don't have anyone that can really emerge in the US that can compete with Facebook or Google or any of these other big tech companies that exist out there, these social media apps, right? And I think the emergence of an app like Blue Sky is a sign of hope because it's decentralized and no one really controls it. It gives the individual the most control over their data, the most control over what they see, the most control over the algorithm in their feeds. I think building that type of network does encourage competition in the market. And I think we could have that sort of thing and have a balanced approach to regulation without creating this concern over how an overly regulated industry will moat off the industry from any competition emerging.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you for listening. If you liked this episode, be sure to rate it, be sure to review it, and be sure to tell other people you think might like it too. This podcast grows by word of mouth, specifically your mouth. Theme music, courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you again for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.